I know we're going to try to do this in about 15 minutes and then leave 5 minutes for questions, so it will be a hectic pace, I'm sure. What I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about is I'm the manager of the Ecosystem Services program within Alberta Environment and Water. And so one of the things that we've been working on is trying to use ecosystem services and some of the information to support decision making and trade-offs when it comes to cumulative effects. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what ecosystem services are and how they can be used in decision making, whether it's around soils, land use, wetlands, which our pilot was on. And then I'll talk a little bit about our pilot to try to, in very short time, get you guys interested in what we did so you can read the report that we actually just got signed off to put into public domain as of next week. So what are ecosystem services? Who here has heard of ecosystem services or EGS, natural capital? Yeah, the term's been around for a while, so yeah. So we're using ecosystem services the same as you would use any of the EGS terminology. And so these are the important ecosystems and the biodiversity within them give us a stream of goods and services which are really important. And these ecosystem services, why we care as a government person, is they link directly to quality of life or human well-being, which is one of the reasons we have governments out there to do. So there are 4 categories that we use based on what the United Nations came up with in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. The provisioning services are the ones that are quite obvious. They're things like crops and timber and livestock. You go out, you guys can purchase these things at Rona or at your grocery store, so you know that there's a value and you use them in your day-to-day life. The next set of services are the regulating services, and these are the benefits we get from controlling some of our natural processes. So they include things like flood mitigation, erosion and sediment control, and climate regulation. And these are the ones that our department in Alberta Environment and Water, we do a lot of work around regulating services. The third set are the non-material benefits, and these ones are what some people call the fuzzy ecosystem services. These are things like aesthetic, spiritual value, traditional use, recreation, education, science. So these are the ones that, as far as trying to measure them in the world of ecosystem services right now, these have become sort of the most difficult ones because a lot of the values are held within individuals. And the last set are the supporting services, and this is on its own on purpose because these are essential for production of all the other services. So this is when we get into things that things you're interested in, like soil formation, photosynthesis. So and pollination. So these are the ones that without these, life on Earth tends to stand still. If any of you have read Jared Diamond's Collapse, we talk about ruining our soils and ruining our societies. So I think you guys are probably talking to the converted. And so one little example that we've been using pretty much for the last couple of years of doing ecosystem services work is to say, what does this picture represent to you guys? Obviously, people have different perspectives based on whether you think this is a nice grassland or a recreational area. And the example that's used around the world is that this is actually a water filtration plant. And in New York, it's probably the most famous ecosystem service story. They were faced with about an $8 billion new water filtration plant. And so one of the smart guys and gals working in their department said, is there another alternative to building this, manufacturing this $8 billion engineered structure? And when they looked up in the New York Catskills, they realized our water and our water quality is tied to the Catskills. So they end up in the end spending about $2 billion versus $8 billion and going up and doing things like conservation easements, paying for best management practices, etc. And so this is like a no-brainer. You don't need to have an economist or an accountant on staff to realize $8 billion versus, not that Marion, of course, your next speaker, is a brilliant economist, and we want to hear from her. These are the kind of things that, when it comes to some of these decisions we're making, maybe there's a way of looking at an alternative lens and looking at some of these services. Why are these ecosystem services important? Well, because ecosystem services, ecosystems, they underpin all of our other goals, whether it's things around lifestyle or recreation or public health. And so, one of the things that's pretty obvious in our department is 40 years old. I'm trying to blind anybody. Development impacts ecosystems. That's why there's been a Department of Environment for 40 years. What we're trying to become a little bit more aware of and purposeful with is understanding that these ecosystems actually sustain our development goals, whether it's around residential, whether it's around lifestyle, whether it's around some of our health goals. And so that's the key with this. And this very busy diagram, I understand I have a few maybe too many slides for my very brief talk, but this is going to be made available to you guys, and we want to make sure that people are having a chance to take some of these slides and say, okay, how does this connect to some of my work, whether you're a consultant in municipal government, First Nations, Government of Alberta, so that's why the busy slide is there. It's homework for you guys for afterwards. But what we're trying to do is say, why should people care about ecosystem services? If those of you that work in the science realize that just because science says something doesn't mean policy and decision makers actually do anything with it, or it becomes the number one reason why things happen. There's a lot of other factors. So what we say is, if we understand what some of these services are, and we can connect them with people and why they're important, we can actually link them, and what they do is to the different constituents of well-being or quality of life. And if we can make that case about why pollination is really important, or why soil formation is really important to some of our bigger goals, then we can start getting the buy-in of whether the general public or some of our politicians, because it means something to them. So because most of these services are not considered in our decision making, these are leading to unintended consequences. So instead of being proactive in saying this natural fescue landscape provides a number of services that are important to keep intact, we tend to be working on the other end and being reactive and trying to figure out how can we mitigate some of the goals and plans that we've had underway. And of course, we know what 2006, 7, and 8 were like in Alberta. It was, things were taking off at an uncontrollable speed. And so what we're doing now with the land use framework and ALSA and the Water for Life and a number of those things is trying to say, how can we get ahead of this? And we think using an ecosystem service approach is a tool that helps us understand what's happening on the landscape. So some of the things we need to look about, some of the conversations we need to have with people is, well, these ecosystem services are great, they're out there, but so what? Why should I care? And some of the early work we did on the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, SSRP, was to look at the different major stakeholder groups and say, from an agricultural perspective, what services are you actually dependent upon to actually meet the mandate of your stakeholder group? So for agriculture, obviously some of the key ones, things like pollination and a clean, reliable water supply. For tourism, we need to have that aesthetic beauty, reasons why people actually want to go and look at something. Spiritual and traditional use, why are people going up to the mountains? What's the reason? And then for our having a clean and healthy environment, we have things like erosion and sediment control, climate regulation, gas regulation. So this is about having a conversation with people to connect them with why this stuff matters, like so what? So one of the opportunities we think that we have, and we've been exploring this within the government of Alberta, people like Karen and Rob, and Marion was working on the pilot with us last year, was if we could actually start to recognize some of these services. We're not saying don't pave over that wetland and put a parking lot. If that is the best use of that land, that's fine. That's a goal that needs to be decided by the decision makers. What we're saying is you should understand the trade-offs, what you're losing by taking out that wetland, and maybe what you're gaining by putting something else in. And because these services right now, these benefits and values aren't part of most policy decisions and most trade-off decisions, we're leaving them out. They're being left to be something we have to deal with afterwards. Oops. So some of the opportunities that we think that we can use ecosystem services, and I'll just pause for 1 minute with Rob being my time counter.
You're at 9 minutes.
I'm at 9 minutes, excellent. Is that we've been looking at using ecosystem services to supporting some of the work we do within Alberta Environment and Water around cumulative effects. How do we understand the cumulative impact? How do we understand what we have on the landscape? But we think there's a number of opportunities at any group. And there's a lot of groups in Alberta besides the government of Alberta, and some have been out in front way before us using this information. People like Ducks Unlimited, Alberta ABMI, Alberta Biodiversity and Monitoring Institute, Prairie Conservation Forum, University of Calgary, University of Alberta. So it's not like we're the only ones working on this, but what we see from some of the work we've done so far is there's some opportunities of using this approach to provide a framework for integrating some of these ecosystem services from an economic, a biophysical, and a sociocultural perspective into decisions. There's science-based evidence, so it's fine to say we should leave that because it's important, but what decision makers want to know is if you want me to make a decision to leave that grassland alone, you better have some evidence for when I go up and have to talk about this and get beaten up for, saving a grassland means, it's a detriment to the economy. I need to have that evidence to support why this is important to maintain. It also gives us a number of qualitative and quantitative methodologies to actually come up with some of these benefits, so we actually have some evidence. It also integrates those information on sort of that 3 legs, the sustainability stool, the social, economic, and environmental, so we can have a holistic conversation versus a environment versus economy. And ultimately, our hope is that this is going to improve cumulative effects on the landscape. So it's going to help us with better management of our landscapes. So the second part of the pilot is, or of the project, is to talk a little bit about the pilot. And this pilot project was one of the objectives of our executive after we spent some time working on the SSRP in 2008, 2009. And what they said was, it's great that you're looking at this huge region, but what we don't know is, can you get down on the land, right on the, on a very small scale, and actually tell us what is this area giving us for services? How are our development decisions impacting this area? And so this pilot project started in 2010, and the outcome of the pilot was to see if we could develop and operationalize this ecosystem service approach to actually inform better decision making. And so some of the objectives were to inform using these different tools to support cumulative effects, to explore ways of looking at these broader suite of social, economic, and environmental benefits, especially on that social side, because people call it the fuzzy stuff, and it's really hard to actually put it in a meaningful way to have a dialogue about it. And I'm going to keep going. There were 44 participants over the 16-month period. The main group was there for 12 months, and they included 5 departments, and including the Land Use Secretariat. We had people like Alberta Innovates, we had Marion involved. Both Rob and Karen, your hosts for this session, were involved in the pilot for Alberta Agriculture. Ducks Unlimited, University of Alberta, a number of people. We also partnered with the City of Calgary and Rocky View, and we really partnered. One of the reasons this was a success from their perspective, it wasn't the government coming and saying, we are going to do this. It was us getting together and saying, how can we do this together to support decision making? And then it had a number of international experts, because we focused on wetlands and current wetland approval processes in Alberta. And our specific case study area was down in Rocky View, Calgary, to say, how can we support and provide information for some of the gaps right now in your decision-making process around wetlands? So this is just a quick snapshot of our case study area. We've called it the Greater Shepherd Slough area. And so it's an area where right now there's a lot of flood issues, so it really did have a very significant issue that that whole area is trying to work on. And of course, flood mitigation is one of the key ecosystem services provided by wetlands. We actually had to spend a lot of time understanding what the actual issue was. So we spent a lot of time with people like Municipal Affairs, Calgary, Rocky View, and our people trying to figure out what is our current approvals approach right now. And one of the big lessons we learned in understanding that there's a planning phase and an approval phase is this is not the same approvals that happens in Edmonton or in Peace River or in Lethbridge. And so there are definitely these very contextual, very place-based ways that the approval process has started. So then what we did for this area is we said, where are the gaps in this? Like, where can we fill some gaps for you guys? And the 3 key gaps that we focused on for the year were, we don't have enough information to support avoidance and minimization. We're often in Alberta going straight to compensation for wetlands instead of saying you need to avoid this wetland. So how can we give them some information to support that? Can we provide some information on cumulative effects? Because of course, most approvals are done on very small site-specific areas, and we know that those areas drain into other areas. Land bases and watersheds are not just one little parcel of land that's being developed for a residential subdivision, it's connected. So how can we help with that? And then there's a limited ability to communicate some of these values, these cultural and social values. So what we did, and I'm going to go through this really quickly because I'm trying to get you interested in reading the report that we've got and seeing some of the actual evidence that we came up with, is we tried to look at a number of ways to pictorially give evidence to help with those gaps. So this snapshot is about the difference in loss of wetlands between 1965 and 2005. So you can start to see where wetlands are being lost off the landscape. This slide, which I put in as a plug for you guys to look at, is trying to figure out how do we actually tell the story to people? Like, what are the actual assets that we're looking at when we look at wetlands? What are the actual functions that wetlands give? And then once we get that sort of sciencey stuff, what do people care about? Well, they care about the services and the benefits. So how do we actually start to express these? So for the ecosystem services we focused on from a biophysical or from a environmental perspective, we looked at flood control, water storage, water purification, and carbon storage. Perfect. So this is just a snapshot showing you, this is what we came up with using O2 Planning Design, Dr. Irina Creed, and Ducks Unlimited as our consultants. This is the actual stored amount of water in the wetlands, and you can see a gradient which talks about where are some of the biggest storage potentials that wetlands are providing, and then where are they actually some of the lower ones. So when it's coming to land use decisions, we can look at that and say, oh, there might be some benefits in maintaining certain core wetlands from a flood mitigation and from a water storage. This is a wetland flood control index, which shows some of the high values represent where there's great flood control services. And so again, when you're coming with looking at area structure plans or where you're going to build your development, this can fit in with where is there going to be a higher cost of having to deal with flood mitigation, and where should we be maintaining wetlands so that for the overall area, you actually have a place for these floods and water over land to go. From a water purification perspective, we looked at where are the areas of wetlands or wetland complexes where there's high water purification. And where are there areas where there's low? And so just the orange circles are areas where it's negative, and that's generally where their actual developments have already gone in place. So water purification has been lost because wetlands have been impacted already. The green talks about potential. So flying right along, we also looked at a number of economic results. And so just a snapshot again, not to get into the detail, but these different snapshots show the total value of wetland storage in that area and the total value of water purification. So when you talk to developers and you talk to municipal councilors, they want number figures and dollar signs. This starts to help tell the story about why these are important. We also did we did a recreation study on Ralph Klein Park. We looked at property values and we looked at carbon storage and tried to come up with some figures using the best methods that we had available with the best data to start to look at what is some of the contribution of these wetlands when it comes to these different services. Because right now they're not being talked about at all. And then from a sociocultural, or from looking at this cultural values, we did a session, a benefit ranking session with a number of stakeholder groups to say, when it comes to you as an individual, you as representing your stakeholder group, and you representing general society, what are the most important services for you in this area? What are the most important things that wetlands are doing for you? And so the results are quite interesting because we understand that things like recreation and tourism, you might think, oh, maybe people really don't care about it. Well, it came in about middle of the pack. And so that gives us a chance to talk about these kind of services that we don't have dollar signs for, or we don't know exactly how to quantify, but they're still really important to people. So it helps us with that dialogue. So our next steps are, I'm very happy to announce last week we got okay from our communications and executive that we are actually publishing our first report that Karen and Marion and Rob and a number of other people worked on. And so we really encourage people to, we'll give you the website so you can actually take a look at that, because we think it's advancing the science and the economics and sociocultural methodology around ecosystem services to a new level, not to the only level, we're not the best, but we've definitely taken it to a level where we're actually seeing some evidence that this could be used to support cumulative effects. We're doing presentations right now, and we're trying to make sure that we're assessing the credibility and legitimacy of this actual approach, because one of the things that will kill this whole idea is if someone comes out and says, we found the silver bullet, you know it's going to tank. So we've, in our report, been really open with, here are all the warts, here are all the things we did wrong, here are all the things that we believe could be done better, and here's what you can do with the information that we've done to date. So I'm going to close by saying we have been put up for an award by Sustainable Resource Development for an award of excellence for this project. And in March, I'm being sent to Germany to present this project at the United Nations Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, where we've been invited, because not that we've done the best science or economics or sociocultural, but we're one of the few places in the world where a government is actually trying to use this inside decision making. Most of the other studies are being done by academics or researchers trying to talk about the, don't save the mangroves, don't have shrimp farming, those kind of things. So this is what's novel about this, and why we've been invited to speak is this is a government trying to say, yeah, this might be actually an additional tool to help make sure we make better decisions on the landscape now instead of being reactive and doing it later. I know I went over, but
10 seconds.
10 seconds, hooray!
We're good.
Great.